The distress signal was not supposed to be there. It came in as a low pulse, buried under 3 layers of static, using a military encoding that the Concorde had officially retired 41 years ago. Sierra, the navigation system aboard the hauler Steadfast Run, flagged it as a probable echo. A ghost signal bouncing off an old relay buoy somewhere in the dead stretch of the Venn corridor. She gave it a 14% chance of being real. She logged it, noted it, and moved on. Dorian Hale read the log while eating a sandwich. He was 3 days out from Waypoint Done, carrying colony resupply cargo for a mid-range agricultural contract that paid barely enough to keep his fuel costs covered. He was not a young man anymore, but he was not old enough to feel it. Most days, he had brown hair going gray at the sides, work-worn hands, and the particular kind of patience that only people who spent long stretches alone in deep space seemed to develop. He was used to silence. He was used to the kind of work where nobody noticed if you did it well, only if you did it wrong. He read the signal log twice. Then he told Sierra to plot a course toward the source. She told him the detour would cost him 4 hours and nudge him outside his approved corridor window, which would trigger a filing fee with the Waypoint Authority. He said he understood. She asked if he was sure. He said yes. She recalculated the route without further comment, though the slight pause before she confirmed felt like the machine equivalent of a sigh. The Venn corridor was not a place that invited lingering. It was a long, flat stretch of dead space between 2 shipping clusters, used mainly because it was direct. There were no stations along it, no patrol routes, no emergency coverage. Worth speaking of, if something went wrong in the Venn corridor, you handled it yourself, or you did not handle it at all. Most pilots who flew it did so quickly and did not look around. Dorian looked around. He found it 40 minutes off his original heading. A freighter, but not a standard one. It was built in the Drackery-style heavy plating, angular lines, with the kind of reinforced hull that said the people who made it expected to be shot at and intended to survive it. The ship was large enough that the Steadfast Run looked almost embarrassing beside it, but the Drackery freighter was running on one engine at maybe 30% output, and the other engine was cold. One of its exterior lights was cycling on and off in a slow, arrhythmic pattern, not by design. Dorian ran a scan. 1 life sign. Drackery. The metabolic readings came back low, very low. Sierra added a quiet note to the scan summary. At current metabolic rate, she estimated meaningful deterioration within 40 to 60 hours. He opened a comm channel. The response came after a long pause. The voice was deep, rougher than gravel, with the particular resonance that Drackery voices had when they were making an effort to speak in a language that was not their own. The translation matrix on the Steadfast Run worked well enough, but some things did not fully translate. The tone came through regardless. Human vessel. You are outside your approved corridor window. Continue on your assigned route. It was not a greeting. It was not a distress call. It was a dismissal. Dorian leaned forward in his seat. On the scanner screen, the life sign pulse was slow and uneven. He said, "When did you last eat?" Silence. Not a short silence. Not the silence of someone thinking about whether to answer. It was the silence of someone who had not been asked that question in a very long time, possibly by anyone, and certainly not by a human they had never met in a dead shipping corridor in the middle of nowhere. The voice, when it came back, was quieter. Not softer, just quieter. That is not your concern. Dorian looked at the scan. He looked at the slow, labored pulse of the life sign. He looked at the dead engine. "I'm going to dock," he said. "You don't have to let me in, but I'm going to pull up alongside, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't shoot at me." Another silence. Longer this time. No weapons lock appeared on his board. Dorian took that as close enough to permission. He began the docking sequence manually, easing the Steadfast Run toward a lot of work in tight spaces over the years. Sierra tracked the approach and kept her observations to herself, which was its own kind of commentary. The airlock on the Drackery ship did not open automatically. Dorian waited. After 3 minutes and 40 seconds, it opened. He unstrapped from the pilot's seat, pulled on his jacket, and went to the cargo hold. He stood there for a moment, looking at the sealed crates of colony rations, stacked neatly along the wall. A full contract load. His pay for this run. He thought about the filing fee he was already going to owe the Waypoint Authority. He thought about the fuel cost of the detour. Then he started loading a handcart. He did not take all of it. He took enough. He also grabbed the portable camp stove from his personal kit, the one he used on long hauls when he did not want to eat cold food out of a sealed pouch for the fourth night in a row. He checked the fuel cell. It was full. He pushed the cart to the airlock and stepped through into a corridor built for something much larger than him. The lights inside the Dracari ship were dim and reddish. The air was warmer than he expected, and the ceiling was far above his head. He moved slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible. He did not want to surprise anyone. He had a feeling that surprising this particular passenger would be a poor decision. He found the main hold at the end of the corridor, and standing in the center of it, still as a statue, watching him with eyes that caught the dim light like polished amber, was the largest living thing Doran had ever stood in the same room with. Groth was old. Even someone who had never seen a Dracari before would have known it immediately. He was massive, easily 3 times Doran's height, with scales that had faded from the dark bronze of his youth to something closer to aged copper, scarred in a dozen places, carrying the particular stillness of something that had once been very dangerous and had not entirely stopped being so. His wings were folded close against his back. His tail moved once, slowly as Doran entered the hold, and then went still. He did not speak. Doran looked up at him. He did not look away, and he did not look frightened, which was either very brave or a sign that he had not fully processed the situation. He set the handcart down. He set up the camp stove on the floor of the hold. He cracked the first crate and began to work. He said, without looking up, "I figured I was hungry anyway. Seemed rude to eat alone." Groth said nothing. But he did not leave. There are things that take courage to do, and there are things that a person simply does, without stopping to name them, because the moment requires action, and the body moves before the mind can raise an objection. Doran Hale was not a brave man in any formal sense. He had never been in a war. He had never been decorated, promoted, or singled out. He was a hauler who flew cargo between colonies and waypoints, and the most dangerous thing in his usual week was navigating the filing requirements of the Waypoint Authority without triggering a late penalty. Standing in the hold of a Dracari ship, heating food on a camp stove while an enormous, scarred, ancient dragon watched him from 6 feet away, this was somewhat outside his usual week. He did not let on that it bothered him. He worked steadily. The colony rations were a mixed lot, because the contract had been for general resupply protein blocks, compressed grain meal, dried vegetable matter, some sealed pouches of a thick, calorie-dense paste that the manufacturer called nourishment supplement, and that Doran privately called terrible. He set the terrible paste aside. He worked with what was usable. Dracari physiology was not something he had studied in detail, but he knew the broad strokes. They were apex predators, obligate meat eaters primarily, but capable of processing a wide range of organic material in a survival context. Their digestive systems were built for variety in a way that most predator species were not. He had read that once, in a Concord species summary that he had skimmed years ago for no particular reason. He heated the protein blocks first. He added the grain meal as a base, pressed it flat, and let it char slightly at the edges the way he liked it. He opened 2 more crates and kept building the volume up, because the life sign readings he had seen on the scanner were severe, and he was not going to fix a starvation problem with a small meal. Groth watched all of this. He had not moved. He stood in the center of his hold like something carved from old stone, and his amber eyes tracked every movement Doran made with a precision that was difficult to look at directly. It was not hostile exactly. It was the attention of something that had spent a very long life observing things carefully and deciding what they were. He was trying to decide what Doran was. He had been a fleet admiral once. He had commanded warships, negotiated treaties, led military campaigns on 3 different fronts in the border wars that the younger species still read about in their history courses. He had dealt with humans before, in the formal capacity exchanges across conference tables, where the humans were always trying too hard to seem composed and the effort was usually visible. He had not thought much of them. They were young. They were loud. They were chaotic in the way that young species always were, full of energy pointed in too many directions at once. They had joined the Concord 60 years ago with the particular enthusiasm of someone arriving at a gathering they had not been invited to, and they had spent those 60 years making everyone at the gathering mildly uncomfortable. He had not expected one of them to board his ship without a weapon. He had not expected one of them to cook. The smell was reaching him now, and this was a problem, because his body was not his ally at the moment. He had not eaten in 11 days. His clan had exiled him, quietly, without public ceremony, because a public exile of someone of his standing would have created complications, and he had taken his personal freighter and gone. He had not planned carefully. He had packed his pride and his old military codes, and not much else. Pride did not have caloric value. He watched the human work. The human was not watching him back, most of the time. He was focused on the stove, adjusting things, tasting things, adding something from a small container in his jacket pocket, some kind of seasoning, applied with the casualness of someone who found this process completely normal. He was not performing. He was not trying to impress. He was simply cooking, in the hold of a Dracari warship, on a camp stove that was slightly too small for the space, with the particular concentration of someone who took small tasks seriously. Groth found this more disorienting than anything else. When the food was ready, the human set it out on the flat top of an open crate and stepped back. He did not present it. He did not make a show of it. He sat down on the floor with his own much smaller portion and began eating. He said, "It's not what you'd choose, I know, but it's hot and there's a lot of it, and hot, and a lot of it covers most situations in my experience." Groth said nothing for a long time. The smell in the hold was impossible to ignore. His body had moved past the point where pride could override biology, and he was aware of this in the cold, clinical way that a mind under serious physical stress becomes aware of its own limits. He had two choices. He could refuse and maintain the dignity that his culture had built into him over the course of a very long life, or he could eat and live and deal with the rest of it afterward. He moved to the crate. He ate. He ate in the deliberate, controlled way of someone who was ravenous and determined not to show it. He did not eat quickly. He ate steadily, with the same stillness he brought to everything, and the human sat on the floor nearby and ate his own small portion and did not stare. That last part mattered. Doran was not watching him, not cataloging the spectacle of a great Dracari elder eating colony rations off the top of a cargo crate in a drifting freighter. He was looking at the wall. He was looking at his food. He was, at one point, looking at something in his jacket pocket that he was reading on a small personal device. He was giving Groth the privacy of being unremarkable. Groth had not expected this. When the meal was finished, Doran cleaned up the camp stove, resealed the remaining crates, and said he was going to look at the engine. He did not ask permission. He said it the way someone says they are going to check on something. That is simply part of what needs doing. Groth said, "You are not an engineer." Doran said, "No, but I've fixed enough things badly to know the difference between a bad fix and no fix at all." He went to look at the engine. He was in there for 2 hours. Groth heard him working the sound of tools, the occasional quiet word that was probably directed at the navigation system on his own ship, the sound of something being detached and then reattached. At one point there was a loud clang followed by silence, and then the quiet word again. When Dorian came back, he said the secondary drive was back to about 60%. He had used parts from his own ship's secondary array, which meant his ship would now run on primary systems only. He said this the same way he said everything, which was to say he said it without any particular weight, as if it were a practical detail rather than a cost. Groth looked at him. "You have damaged your own vessel," he said. "Redirected some parts," Doran said. "I'll pick up replacements at the waypoint. Should get you mobile enough to reach the Gary station. From there you can get a real repair." Groth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" The human looked up at him. His expression was not complicated. He was not performing generosity. He was not seeking recognition. He had the look of someone who had been asked to explain something that seemed obvious to them. He said, "Because you needed it." He said it the way a person's answer to the question that made any sense to him. Groth had lived for 270 years. He had dealt with every species the Concord held. Every one of them that had ever helped him had done. So because there was something in it for them, a favor to be called in, a political alignment to maintain, a transaction to complete. Help was a currency. It was always a currency. He stared at the human for a long time, trying to find the currency in him. He could not find it. Dorian said he should get back to his ship. He said the drive fix would hold for about 40 hours if Groth did not push the engines hard. He said he hoped. The rest of the trip went smoothly. He picked up his camp stove, put it under his arm, and walked back toward the airlock. At the door to the corridor, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said, "Eat when you get to Gary. Don't wait too long. This time." Then he left. Groth stood alone in his hold. The air still smelled of the food the human had cooked. He stood there for a long time, very still, in the way that the Drackery went still when they were thinking through something that their usual frameworks had failed to explain. He was still standing there when he heard the other ship detach. He walked, slowly, to the navigation room. He pulled up the rear external scanner. He watched the steadfast run grow smaller against the dark. He looked at the ship's registry code, displayed in small text on the scanner screen. He memorized it. He did not make a record of it. He simply looked at it, until it was part of him, the way old soldiers memorized the faces of the people who mattered. He did not know why he did this. He stood there until the ship was gone. 6 weeks later, on Waypoint Dun, a Marathi bureaucrat named Reth reviewed a cargo discrepancy report and discovered that a human hauler had delivered approximately 32% less agricultural resupply material than his contract required. Reth had been processing cargo contracts for 11 years. He was thorough, methodical, and completely uninterested in being moved by explanations that did not appear in the relevant forms. He had compound eyes that could read 4 documents simultaneously, which he found useful, and a disposition toward orderly process that he found even more useful. He was not cruel. He was simply precise. And precision, when applied to human behavior, had a way of feeling like cruelty. He pulled the full file on the hauler. Duran Hale, registered independent cargo contractor, 7 years operating in the mid-range corridor routes. No prior contract violations. 1 prior late delivery due to a navigation system fault, which had been documented and excused. Average performance rating. Nothing unusual. Until 6 weeks ago. Reth cross-referenced the route logs. He found the deviation from the approved corridor window. He found the emergency docking codes that Doran had used to justify the approach to the Drackery vessel codes that were technically valid, because a life sign in distress was a life sign in distress, but which required an official Concord emergency authorization to use, which Doran had not filed for. Before using them, he had filed a retroactive report. Retroactive reports, the regulations noted clearly, did not cancel the violation. They simply documented it. Reth generated 3 separate notices. The first was a cargo contract breach penalty. The colony administrator had logged a formal complaint over the missing rations, and the financial adjustment came to just under 400 credits, deducted from Doran's contract payment. The second was a corridor deviation filing fee, a flat rate, non-negotiable, 220 credits. The third was a formal licensing caution, noted in Doran's contractor file, for use of emergency docking protocols without prior authorization. He flagged the file for a review meeting. Doran arrived at the Waypoint Authority office at the scheduled time, which was the only notable thing he had done correctly in the past 6 weeks from Reth's perspective. He was wearing a jacket with a frayed collar and had the look of someone who had eaten irregularly for several days, which was, Reth had observed, a common state for independent haulers. Reth laid out the violations in order. He did this clearly and without editorializing. Because editorializing was not his job, he handed Doran the summary document. Doran read it. He said, "All right, Reth waited. Doran did not say anything else. Reth said, "Do you have a statement regarding the cargo shortage?" "The colony administrator would like the record to reflect an explanation," Doran said. "I gave the cargo to a Dracari elder who was starving to death in the Vin corridor." Reth processed this. He said, "You used your contract cargo as a personal provision for a non-contract party." Doran said, "He didn't have anything. His engines were out. He hadn't eaten in 11 days. Reth looked at his documents. Then he looked at Doran. He was not an unkind being, but he was genuinely puzzled in a way that was slightly more difficult to maintain professional composure around than he was used to. He said, "Hail, the Dracari elder you are describing, was this individual known to you?" Doran said, "No." "Did he request your assistance?" "No." "Did the cargo you provided constitute a legal gift transfer with proper Concord documentation?" "I didn't think about that at the time." "Are you aware that under Concord Shipping Regulation 17-4, cargo registered to a specific contract manifest cannot be diverted to non-contract parties without prior authorization, regardless of circumstances?" Doran said he was aware of it now. Reth noted this in the file. He generated the formal documentation. He stamped the caution notice. He asked Doran if he had anything further to add for the record. Doran said, "Was anyone else going to stop? In the corridor? Was there a patrol route? Was there someone on their way?" Reth thought about this. The Vin corridor had no patrol coverage. This was a budgetary reality that came up in Concord review meetings every 2 years and was noted and tabled every 2 years. The nearest emergency response station to the stretch of corridor in question was approximately 9 hours away at standard response speed. A Dracari vessel with a cold engine and a single life sign reading at critical metabolic levels, broadcasting on a retired military code that most automated systems would not even recognize as active. No. The honest answer was that no one was coming. Reth did not say this. He said, "That is outside the scope of this review." Doran nodded. He took the summary document. He left. Reth sat at his desk for a moment after the door closed, looking at the open file. Then he stamped the closure form and moved on to the next case. He had 19 more to review that day. The colony administrator received his formal complaint response. The cargo shortage was noted. The case was closed. The rations that had been delivered were distributed, and the shortage was covered by a supplemental transfer from the regional reserve, which took 3 weeks to process and arrived with an administrative note that this kind of shortfall should not happen again. Nobody wrote down why it happened. Doran, who was by this point back on a new contract route running equipment parts to a mining settlement near the edge of the corridor network, ate a cold meal from a sealed pouch and ran his numbers in his head. After the penalties, the reduced contract payment, and the cost of the parts he had used to fix Grotha's secondary drive, he was down roughly 1,100 credits from where he should have been. That was almost a month of comfortable operating margin gone. He thought about this for a while. Syrah, who had been monitoring his biometric readouts with the low-level attention she applied to everything, noted that his heart rate was relaxed and his stress indicators were within normal range. She said, "You are not upset." He said, "Not really." She said, "You are aware that you lost 1,100 credits and received a formal licensing caution for assisting someone who did not ask to be assisted and did not thank you." He said, "I'm aware." She said, "I want to note that this is not rational behavior." He said, "Probably not." She processed this. She said, "Do you regret it?" He ate the last of his cold meal, sealed the empty pouch, and looked out at the dark of the corridor ahead. He said, "No." Syrah noted this in her behavioral log, filed it, and returned to monitoring the route. In the cargo hold, where there were now empty spaces where 4 crates used to be, the air smelled faintly of nothing in particular. The camp stove was back in its corner, cleaned and packed away. Nobody noticed the empty space except Doran, and Doran did not mind it. He had made the detour. He had cooked the meal. He had taken apart part of his own ship to fix a stranger's engine. He had been fined, penalized, and noted in a file. The galaxy had observed all of this and found it mildly inconvenient and moved on. This was how it usually went in Doran's experience. You did the thing that needed doing, and the paperwork caught up with you, and nobody threw a parade. That had never been the point. He reached for the next sealed pouch, realized it was also cold, and made a mental note to fix the galley heating unit before the next run. Some problems, at least, had simple solutions. Time moves differently for the long-lived. A human lifetime is a short and urgent thing, full of pressure, always running towards some edge the person can feel even when they cannot see it. The Dracari did not have this feeling. They had centuries, and centuries taught a different rhythm, slower, deeper, more patient in its observations, more deliberate in the conclusions it reached. They watched things unfold the way a cliff watches the sea, quietly, from a distance, over a very long time. Groth reached Gary Station. He had his ship repaired. He ate real food, the kind his body was built for, and he spent 3 days recovering the strength that 11 days of starvation had taken from him. Then he went home. The return to his clan was not a simple thing. He had left in exile, which meant he returned under political conditions that required careful management. He was old enough and his history was long enough that the exile had always been fragile. A political maneuver, not a genuine casting out. He was too prominent for that. His name was too old in the Dracari record. Over several months, through a series of formal proceedings that were tedious to the point of being almost meditative, his standing was restored. Not all the way. Some things cannot be fully restored. Once broken, but enough. He returned to his clan's council. He resumed, in a diminished but functional capacity, his role in Dracari political life. And he began to watch humans. He did not announce this. He did not make it official. He did not file a research proposal or seek authorization from the council. He simply started paying attention in the methodical way he had paid attention to everything across his long life, and he kept a private record. He had the registry code of the Steadfast Run. He could track it through the Concord shipping network whenever he wished, and sometimes he did, in the idle way of checking on something he had no reason to check on. He watched it move through the corridors, back and forth, contract to contract, unremarkable and steady. He did not reach out. He had nothing to say. He simply watched. And while he watched Doran, he also watched others. There was a human medical team that responded to a distress call from a Yinthari colony, the Yinthari, who had voted against human Concord membership and had made their position on human intelligence publicly known on 2 separate occasions. The colony had a fever outbreak. The human team arrived before anyone else and stayed until the outbreak was contained. They asked nothing in return. The Yinthari colony administrator sent a formal report to the Concord that described their assistance as unexpected. Groth noted this. He noted the word unexpected. There was a human cargo pilot, not Doran, a different one, who found a disabled Pulhari research vessel in the outer lanes of the Tariff Passage. The Pulhari. Aboard were researchers from a university that had publicly lobbied to reduce human voting weight in the Concord Science Committee. The pilot towed the vessel to the nearest station, transferred his own emergency oxygen reserves because the Pulhari supply had a fault, and filed for reimbursement of the oxygen from the Concord Emergency Fund, which he received 3 months later, minus an administrative processing fee. Groth noted this. He found another case, then another. He found them the way you find a pattern. When you begin to look for one, slowly at first, and then faster, as the shape of it becomes clear and you start to recognize what you are seeing. Humans were consistently present at incidents in the low-coverage zones. Not all humans, not every human, but with a frequency that exceeded what their percentage of registered corridor traffic would predict. They stopped for strangers. They stopped for species that disliked them. They stopped for individuals who could not pay them, would not thank them, and would in some cases actively resent the implication that they had needed help. They did this, and they got fined for it, the way Doran had been fined. They did this, and they lost contract payments and received caution notices and went home with less money than they left with. And then they did it again and again. Groth tried to find the pattern underneath the pattern. He was a strategist. He had spent 2 centuries studying behavior and motivation. Every species he had ever studied had an underlying logic to their actions, even the ones whose logic was not immediately visible. The Marathi helped within defined networks because it strengthened their trade alliances. The Drakari helped their own clan members because clan cohesion was survival. The Pulhari helped those who shared their intellectual frameworks because knowledge communities required investment. Every act of apparent generosity had a mechanism beneath it. He could not find the mechanism beneath this. He tried for a long time. He built models. He tested them against his data. He refined them, adjusted them, rebuilt them from different starting assumptions. The models kept failing. They kept predicting that rational beings would stop. Stopping for strangers once the cost became consistent and the reward became reliably non-existent. Humans kept stopping anyway. He searched his own language for a word that explained it. Drakari was an old and complex language, capable of expressing states of mind that many younger languages had no vocabulary for at all. He knew words for strategic generosity. He knew words for clan obligation assistance. He knew words for the calculated display of wealth through giving, and words for the kind of help offered to elevate the giver's social position. He knew words for mercy toward a defeated enemy. He knew words for the assistance given to a being that you expected would one day assist you in return. He did not know a word for helping a stranger in a dead shipping lane, with no audience, no political benefit, no expectation of return, no clan obligation, no transaction, just the plain, quiet act of doing something because the situation required it and no one else was there. He spent a long time on this problem. Years, then decades. He found the word eventually. It was not a Drakari word. He found it in the human language files in the Concord Translation Archive, in a section covering concepts that were considered culturally specific and difficult to render in universal translation. He read the entries there and stopped at one. The word was simple, one syllable, old, in the way that words for basic things are old, worn smooth by long use. He read the definition. He read it again. He read the supporting notes, the etymological history, the cross-cultural usage examples. He sat with the word for several days. And then he put it away, in the careful place where he kept the things he was not finished thinking about, and he kept watching. 180 years after the Venn corridor, the Concord High Chamber scheduled a formal session to consider a proposal submitted by 3-member species. The proposal was to reclassify humanity as a provisional tier member, reducing their voting rights, limiting their trade protections, and placing their full membership under a 5-year review cycle requiring a 2/3 supermajority. To renew, the stated grounds were demonstrated cultural instability and behavioral unpredictability in shared governance spaces. The session was scheduled. Member species were invited to submit testimony. Groth, who was now one of the oldest living beings to hold active Concord standing, requested to testify. The chamber noted his request. It was, by any standard, an unusual move. He was Drakari. His clan's position on human influence was neutral at best. He had no known relationship with human political entities. There was no obvious transactional reason for a Drakari, elder of his standing, to involve himself in the question of human membership status. The chamber approved his testimony request and tried not to appear puzzled. They did not succeed. Groth prepared no written statement. He did not rehearse. He had been speaking in chambers like this one for over 2 centuries, and he had learned a long time ago that the things worth saying did not benefit from rehearsal. He knew what he was going to say. He had known for a long time. The high chamber of the Concord of sentient races was built to be impressive. It occupied the upper third of the Concord's primary station, a structure that had been expanded so many times over 4 centuries that its original core was now buried somewhere in the middle of it, too old to find without specialized equipment and too important to remove. The chamber itself was a wide, tiered space, designed so that every seat looked down at the central floor and nothing on the central floor looked down at anything else. The architecture was a political statement, as most architecture in places like this tended to be. Groth entered from the north corridor, which was the one wide enough for him. He moved slowly. He had always moved slowly, but the slowness of great age was different from the slowness of deliberate calm. He was aware of the difference. His body reminded him of it regularly, in the way that very old bodies have of turning every movement into a small negotiation. He did not hurry. There was nothing to hurry toward. He took his position on the central floor. The chamber was full. The proposal under consideration had drawn attention. Most of the major member species had sent at minimum an observer delegation, and many had sent full voting representatives. The human delegation sat in the east tier. 12 people, composed, visibly uncertain about where this was going, and trying not to show it. Groth noticed them. He did not look at them long. The Concord's presiding officer, a senior Marathi administrator named Lev, called the session to order and introduced Groth by title and clan standing. Groth was technically the third speaker in the testimony schedule. The previous two had spoken in support of the reclassification proposal, both of them making measured, documentation-heavy arguments about human behavior patterns in shared governance, sessions, human resistance to certain forms of treaty compliance, and what they called the inherent difficulty of working with a species whose decision-making appeared to be driven substantially by emotional response rather than structured logic. Both of them had made their arguments well. Groth had listened to both without expression. Now he stood on the central floor of the high chamber, and the room was quiet. In the particular way a room full of political beings goes quiet when they are uncertain what is coming. He said, "I will not speak about treaty compliance records today. I will not speak about governance behavior metrics. There are people in this chamber far better suited to that kind of argument than I am, and they have already made it, or they will make it after I am finished." He paused. "I am going to tell you a story. I am going to ask you to be patient with me, because I am very old, and the kind of story I have to tell takes a moment to arrive at its point." Several delegates shifted in their seats. Dracari elders telling stories in political chambers was not a common occurrence. It was also not something you interrupted. He said, 183 years ago, I was traveling alone in the Vin corridor. My engine had failed. I had not eaten in 11 days. I was not going to ask for help. My culture does not ask for help, not from outsiders. Not under any circumstances that my culture considers honorable. I was prepared to die in that corridor before I would broadcast a formal distress call. Silence. A human cargo hauler picked up an old military signal I had inadvertently left running. He was not required to investigate. Investigating cost him route time and filing violations. His navigation system, on the available evidence, strongly advised him to continue on his assigned course. He looked slowly around the room. He investigated anyway. He boarded my ship without a weapon. He cooked me a meal on a camp stove he brought from his own galley. He used parts from his own vessel to repair my engine. He gave me a significant portion of cargo he was under contract to deliver to a colony, which resulted in financial penalties and a formal caution notice on his licensing record. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. When I asked him why he was doing this for a stranger who had not requested his assistance, he said, "Because you needed it." The chamber was very still. He said it as a fact. He said it the way you state something that is simply true and requires no additional explanation. I did not understand this. I tried to find a hidden motivation. I could not find one. I spent the better part of 2 centuries trying to build a framework that would explain his behavior in terms I understood. I could not build it. He paused again. His voice was steady, unhurried. I searched my own language for a word that described what he had done. I did not find one. The Dracari language is very old. It has words for a great many things. It does not have a word for helping a stranger with no expectation of return, no political benefit, no clan obligation, and no audience. It does not have this word because, for most of our history, we have not had a use for it. He let that land. Over the years that followed, I compiled a private record of human activity in the Concord's low-coverage corridors and dead zones, the places where no one is watching, where no contract enforcement exists, where the choice to stop costs real money and no one will know if you do not I have that record. It covers 162 years. It documents over 4,000 individual incidents. In each of those incidents, humans were among the first to respond. And in the majority of them, humans were the only ones who responded. He looked at the East Tier, just for a moment. To be clear, I am not saying all humans do this. I am not saying no other species does. I am saying that when I ran the numbers across the documented case record, the pattern was not subtle. The pattern was significant enough that a person of my experience, looking at it, would have a very difficult time calling it coincidence. He returned his gaze to the general chamber. The proposal before this chamber describes humanity as culturally unstable and behaviorally unpredictable. I have considered this characterization carefully. I understand why it was applied. Humans are loud. They resist process. They disagree with each other publicly and frequently. They respond to situations with emotion rather than formal protocol, and this makes them difficult to work within certain kinds of governance structures. These are fair observations. He paused. They are also not the most important observations. They are the ones that are visible on the surface, and the Concorde has spent 60 years looking at the surface. I would like to suggest that the chamber look somewhere else. He said, in the places where no one is watching, in the corridors with no patrol routes, in the dead zones where the emergency response time is 9 hours, and the signal is too old for most automated systems to read. That is where you will find what I found. He drew himself up, slowly, to his full height. I spent a very long time looking for a word in my own language to describe what that human did for me. I eventually found a word. It is not from my language. I borrowed it from theirs. The chamber was very quiet. It is an old word in the human vocabulary. Short, common. They use it so often that I believe many of them have stopped noticing it. But I noticed it. I noticed it the day I first read it in a Concorde translation archive in a section labeled Cultural Concepts Difficult to Render in Universal Translation. He paused one final time. The word is decency. He said it simply, not as a declaration, not as a verdict, as the conclusion of a very long thought. I formally oppose the reclassification proposal. I recommend the continuation of full, unconditional human membership rights in the Concorde of sentient races. I make this recommendation on the basis of 183 years of evidence, beginning with a meal cooked on a camp stove in the Venn corridor by a man who did not know I was anyone and did not care. He lowered his head, slightly, toward the presiding officer. I am finished. The chamber did not applaud. It was too stunned for applause. Political chambers did not usually go quiet out of something like awe, but this one had, and the quiet lasted long enough that it became its own kind of answer. The human delegation in the East Tier was very still. One of them, a young woman near the back, pressed her hands together on the table in front of her and looked down at them, and her shoulders moved once, with something she did not let become sound. Groth walked back toward the north corridor. He did not rush. He never rushed. He had said what he came to say. The colony was called Hartwell, which was not a remarkable name for a colony. But the place itself had a particular quality that Doran had come to value in his old age. It was quiet, not empty. There were about 4,000 people living there, spread across a series of low buildings and agricultural plots that stretched out across a flat plain under a yellowish sky, but quiet in the way of places where people have agreed, collectively, to keep the noise down. Doran had retired there 8 years ago, after his last cargo contract ended, and his body finally had enough of long hauls and cold meals and the particular kind of loneliness that came from spending weeks in a ship that was mostly just him and Syrah. He had found a small house on the edge of the settlement. He did occasional consulting work, short advisory jobs for newer haulers who needed someone who knew the Venn side corridors. He kept a garden, which required more work than he had expected and produced more vegetables than he could eat, which meant he was always giving them to his neighbors, which his neighbors seemed to regard as an acceptable arrangement. He was not wealthy. He was not anything that the galaxy would have looked at and called significant. He was sitting on the low step outside his house one afternoon, looking at nothing in particular, when the transport came down. It was a Dracari military transport, not a warship, a formal courier class vessel, the kind used for official business and dignitary travel. It set down on the flat land east of the settlement with the careful precision of something operated by people who had been trained to land in difficult conditions and found a flat colony plain almost insulting in its simplicity. Hartwell had not hosted a Drackery vessel before. Several of Doran's neighbors came out of their houses to look. The transport sat there for a moment, and then its ramp descended, and a single figure walked down it. Young, as Drackery age was measured, meaning probably less than 100 years old, broad and armored in the formal military uniform of a Drackery fleet officer, which was elaborate and very clearly not designed for hot, yellow sky afternoons. On a small human colony world, he carried a sealed case in both hands, formally. The way you carry something that you have been told matters. He looked around the settlement until he found Doran. Then he walked toward him. Doran stood up from his step. The Drackery officer stopped several feet away. He was perhaps twice Doran's height, which made looking him in the eye require a certain commitment, but Doran managed it without obvious difficulty, the same way he had managed it once before. In a different lifetime, in a dark hold that smelled of old metal and desperation. The officer said, Doran Hale, registered owner and operator of the cargo hauler. Steadfast Run, corridor license number 479-VIN. Doran said, That's me, yes. The officer said, My name is Yal. I am the great-great-grandson of Groth, of the Elder Council of the Drackery Reth clan. My ancestor passed from this life 4 months ago. Doran was quiet for a moment. He said, I'm sorry. Yal looked at him. The expression on a Drackery face was not always easy for humans to read, but the look that crossed Yal's face at those two words was something between surprise and a difficulty he had not prepared for. He said, He lived 287 years and died at peace in his own house, having recently given testimony before the Concord High Chamber. That will be discussed in political records for the next century. He did not require your condolences. Doran said, Maybe not. I'm still sorry. Yal held the sealed case out. He said, He asked that this be delivered to you personally. I spent 8 months locating you. The hauler registry had your waypoint done address, which was no longer valid. The forwarding chain required 4 separate inquiries. Doran took the case. It was heavier than it looked. He said, He knew where to find me. Yal said, He tracked the Steadfast Run's registry for over 100 years. When you sold the ship and retired, the registry trail ended. He had your last known waypoint address and your former contractor ID. The rest required work. Doran looked down at the case. He looked up at Yal. He said, Do you want to come in? It's hot out here. Yal said nothing for a moment. He was young enough that his training was still visible in his posture, the military straightness, the formal composure, the cultural instinct that said you did not simply walk into a human's house on a colony world because you had been asked. His grandfather, however many generations removed, had stood in the same kind of moment once, in a dark hold with a human who had just offered him something he did not know how to accept. Yal was not, he would have said, the kind of Drackery who had that problem. He stepped inside. Doran set the sealed case on the table and put the kettle on without asking whether his guest wanted anything, which was probably a cultural imposition and also completely typical. He found 2 cups. He found a container of something that passed for a nourishing drink and that he generally offered to people who visited, and he set it out. He was not going to cook an elaborate meal this time. He was old, and the afternoon was hot, and the situation called for something simpler than that. He heated 2 portions of the grain loaf he had made that morning. He put them on the table. He sat down. He nodded at the seat across from him. Yal sat. They ate. They did not talk much. Yal ate with the controlled care of someone who had been told by every cultural instinct available to them that this was beneath their dignity, and who was eating anyway because the situation required it, and the food was actually not bad. When the meal was done, Doran opened the case. There were 2 things inside. The first was a data chip. Yal told him it contained a record of personal archive compiled over 162 years, covering human activity in the Concord's low-coverage zones, with analysis and notation in Grotha's own hand. His private project, Yal said, and did not elaborate further, except to say that it had been part of the testimony. The second was a message chip, formatted for personal playback, sealed with Grotha's clan mark. Doran pressed the clan seal, and it opened. He listened to the message alone, later that night, after Y'all had been shown to the spare room that Doran kept in a state of permanent mild disorganization. He sat at the table with the chip in his hand and the case open in front of him. And the colony was quiet outside, and the yellow sky had gone dark. He listened. He listened to a voice he had heard once before, in a different body than the one he had now, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone both younger and more certain. The voice was the same, low, rough, carrying that particular resonance. Slower now, more careful with each word. The kind of careful that comes when a person knows they are saying something they will not have a chance to say again. The narrative did not record what the message contained. Some things are not owed to witnesses. When it finished, Doran sat for a long time at the table. The chip was warm in his palm. The night outside the window made no sound. He had stopped in the Venn corridor because a signal came in and someone was dying and no one else was coming. He had cooked a meal because the person needed to eat, and he had food. He had fixed the engine because the engine was broken, and he had parts. He had left without expecting a thank you because nothing he had done felt like something that required a thank you. He had not known that a very old and very proud being would spend the next 180 years thinking about it. He had not known that a closed-door political session in the Concord High Chamber had turned on the memory of a camp stove and a handcart of colony rations. He had not known that 4 billion humans were still full members of the Concord, still protected, still voting, in part because of something he had done alone, in a dead corridor that the patrol routes did not cover, that the regulations did not require, and that the galaxy had briefly fined him for, and then forgotten. He would not have done anything differently. He set the chip down on the table next to the data archive that represented 162 years of careful, quiet attention from someone he had met once. He looked at it for a while. In the spare room, a Dracari military officer who had been raised to find nothing remarkable about humans lay in a bed that was somewhat too small for him and looked at the ceiling and thought about the meal he had just eaten, which had been simple and warm and offered without ceremony or expectation, and found that he could not, precisely, explain why it had hit him the way it did. He thought about it for a long time. He did not find an explanation. Somewhere in the translation archives of the Concord, in a section covering cultural concepts difficult to render in universal terms, a single word sat in its entry without fanfare or ceremony, worn smooth by long use, waiting to be found by anyone who happened to need it. It was a short word, one syllable, very old, the kind of word that entire civilizations could be built on if people remembered to mean it when they said it. That was, perhaps, exactly the point.